The most dangerous lie in this whole episode is not the one told before the war. It is the one being told after it. The lie after the war is that nobody can really say who pushed this, who framed it, who sold it, who ignored the warnings, or how the decision hardened inside the room. That is the lie. Because based on the reference document in front of us, this sequence is not blurry at all. It is vivid, it is cinematic, it is structured. And once you follow it from start to finish, the problem is not mystery. The problem is cowardice. People still do not want to say the obvious thing in plain English. Benjamin Netanyahu came into Washington, made an aggressive case for war, and the American system moved in that direction even after key people around Trump were already puncturing parts of that case. That is the sequence. And if a country with this much power cannot speak that sentence clearly, then it is not learning from the war. It is preparing the script for the next one. Start with the image. Mid-February, Netanyahu arrives at the White House. Quiet entrance, tight choreography, situation room, screens lit up, Trump seated on one side, Netanyahu directly opposite. Behind the closed doors, a foreign leader is not offering generic concern. He is making a full argument for action. Not next year, not in theory. Now, and the pitch, as laid out in the source document, is exactly the kind of pitch that can seduce a reckless president fast upside. Big transformation, decapitate the regime, cripple Iran, S ability to strike regional partners, prevent Hormuz from being shut. Clear the way for something like a secular outcome on the other side. That is not a narrow military objective. That is a fantasy of controlled history. You hit hard, the regime cracks, the region stabilizes, and somehow the mess does not come back at you. That is what makes this so important. The sales pitch was not small, it required belief. It required imagination. It required a president willing to hear the ending he wanted before confronting the cost. Then the next layer drops in, and this is where the whole story should have changed. Trump's own people begin examining the pitch. Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reportedly warns that this is standard Israeli practice. Oversell the plan, understate the weakness, press hard because they need the United States. The CIA position, as described in the document, is not the same as a political pitch either. Killing top leadership, maybe regime change in the larger sense. Not really replacing the system with something secular and stable, that confidence is not there. Marco Rubio reportedly calls the Israeli assessment nonsense in substance. That is not ambiguity. That is a warning label. So now the record is brutally simple. The hard sell goes in, the internal skepticism comes right behind it, and instead of that skepticism shutting the process down, it gets absorbed. That is the heart of the scandal. A lot of people hear a story like this and imagine one villain and one victim. That is too easy. Netanyahu pushed, Trump chose, advisors hesitated. Nobody forced to stop. That is why I keep coming back to the people around Trump. Not because they created the pitch, but because the document shows how the system failed in the exact place where a functioning system is supposed to work. Look at the 26th of February meeting. Go around the room again. J.D. Vance says it is a bad idea, but if Trump wants it, he will support it. That sentence should be studied in every future disaster inquiry in Washington, because that is how elite dissent disappears. A person marks the danger, then immediately neutralizes his own warning with loyalty. Others do versions of the same thing. National security framing, legal framing, messaging framing, manage the fallout, handle the press, support the president. The objections come into the room already bent at the knee. Even Rubio, in the form presented here, narrows the mission instead of endorsing the giant promise. If the aim is some sweeping regime, change fantasy. No. If the aim is more limited missile damage, maybe that distinction is everything, because it shows the public. Facing myth and the internally plausible objective are already diverging before the decision is even final. When that happens, one thing almost always follows. The war gets sold on the larger story, then defended later on the smaller one. That is exactly the kind of bait and shrink cycle that destroys public trust. And Trump, according to the document, lands on the side of action. I think we need to do it. So let's be honest about responsibility. Trump is responsible because he had the final agency. But the effort to wash everybody else's fingerprints off the buildup is ridiculous. The source document spends serious time on people still resisting even the phrase that Netanyahu urged the United States toward war. They twist themselves into verbal knots. They act as if saying an ally lobbied hard inside the most sensitive room in Washington is some kind of unspeakable leap. Why? Why is that hard to say? If a prime minister gives a 90-minute classified pitch for military action, if he lays out a sweeping upside, if top American officials then debate that pitch, and if the president ultimately moves in that direction, then saying he urged war is not extremism. It is description. The refusal to describe is the real tell, because that refusal is not about precision. It is about protecting the moral comfort of the people who do not want the public to stare directly at how the decision was made. And once the public looks directly at it, too many reputations start shaking. The strongman image shakes. The careful process image shakes. The loyal advisor image shakes. The idea that America was simply responding to neutral necessity starts shaking. Then another detail in the source document lands like a hammer. Tucker Carlson had reportedly warned Trump repeatedly that a war with Iran could destroy his presidency. Trump's answer, "It will be okay, because it always is." That line is not confidence. It is decay. It is what decision. Making sounds like when repetition has burned away seriousness. No doctrine, no burden of proof, no historical humility, just the muscle memory of a man who thinks consequences are things that happen to other people. And that is where the war machine becomes especially dangerous. Because once a leader like that is paired with an ally pressing hard, and a circle of subordinates too weak to hold their objections to the end, the whole process starts functioning like a slide. The details change. The destination does not. First, the threat is dramatized. Then the upside is oversold. Then the skeptics narrow the mission instead of killing it. Then the weak loyalists say they oppose it, but will support it. Then the press operation gets ready. Then the action is sold. Then the public is told not to notice the original sales pitch. Then after the damage begins, language gets cleaned up. That cleanup is already visible all over this story. The regime change talk becomes missile talk. The grand transformation becomes limited achievement. The argument that began with sweeping promises gets reduced into something smaller, safer, and easier to defend on television. That is how political memory gets laundered in real time. And if you are watching closely, you can see the final move too. Make the whole thing sound too complicated for ordinary people to name. Remember, it is not too complicated. A foreign ally pushed hard. Top officials doubted key parts of the pitch. The president knew enough to know the pitch was oversold. The system still moved. And afterward, too many people started pretending the push itself is somehow unsayable. That is not sophistication. That is a cover story wrapped in etiquette. So here's a conclusion I think people are trying hardest to avoid. The real danger was never just that Trump might be manipulated by a bad argument. The real danger is that America now has a governing culture where an argument can be exposed as inflated inside the room and still retain enough political force to produce war outside the room. That means the filter is broken, not weak broken. And when the filter is broken, you stop asking only whether the next intelligence claim is true. You start asking whether truth even matters once ego, alliance pressure, and theatrical toughness lock together. Because if truth mattered enough, the oversell would have stopped the process. It did not. That is why this story will linger. Not because it reveals something exotic, because it reveals something normal. Warnings are given. Doubts are recorded. Agency remains with the president. And yet the machine still arranges itself so that nobody powerful has to stand up in a way that actually changes the outcome. That is how countries drift into wars they later pretend were inevitable. And if the people with access to the room still cannot say what happened in the room without flinching, then the next war is already being prepared in the safest possible place for bad decisions. Inside language that refuses to admit what it already knows.